Hi, I'm Super Train Station H, and welcome to Part 8 of Barrier Aggression, my critical analysis of select material from Autism Confidential, the National Council on Severe Autism's podcast series, in which Karens will get mad at neurodevelopmentally disabled adults for protesting workplace discrimination they face due to the stigma surrounding them for serving as doctors while being clinically diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, with this stigma against autistic doctors being something that NCSA President Jill Escher is so convinced can't possibly exist that she put two of her friends on a Zoom call to have a public indignation meeting and laugh at said autistic doctors and complain about the fact that they not only exist, but are speaking about negative reactions and judgment they receive from others just for existing. Wow, when I say that out loud, it seems kinda extreme and weird on their behalf, especially for people who are part of a non-profit organization that's supposed to be promoting awareness and understanding of the challenges faced by autistic people, including influencing public policy to enhance access to resources autistic people need to fulfill their natural potential. Now, where were we?
But unfortunately, it just really bears no semblance to what autism was when it was initially described by Kanner, when it was studied in the 70s by Rudder, and all the research that we have on autism is not what currently people are terming autism, and that does do a disservice to those who have, I guess, more classic or more true forms of autism.
All right, Dr. Lee Wachtel, a board member on the National Council on Severe Autism, who by her own description specializes in helping who she calls severely autistic people at the Kennedy Kreiger Institute, was complaining about autistic people other than her own patients allegedly being falsely diagnosed and wrongfully self-proclaiming autism as part of a fetish and identity fantasy.
It's become almost like faddish to for individuals who have the types of challenges that are described in that article to adopt the term of, to identify as being autistic. Autism had taken on kind of this character of almost like a fantasy.
Wow. If Dr. Wachtel is not willing to accept non-severely autistic people as being autistic at all, she might as well not describe her own patients as being severely autistic, a phrase that the neurodiversity warriors she dislikes overwhelmingly don't like either. I mean, holy crap, the NCSA and the neurodiversity warriors on Tumblr and TikTok actually agreed on something. By the way, Dr. Galen Wachtel said that in response to a passage from a Spectrum News article read by NCSA President Jill Escher, a passage which specifically concerns Dr. Jalil Chaved, someone who was clinically diagnosed with autism by a licensed professional practitioner.
Never mind the fact that neither of my children even understand what a doctor is, but they use doctors with autism. And here we are told, when Jalil Chaved received a formal diagnosis for autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder at 27 years old, she felt shock, confusion, and relief.
Right, so this person was clinically diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. And what was Dr. Wachtel's response again?
It's become almost like faddish to for individuals who have the types of challenges that are described in that article to adopt the term of, to identify as being autistic. And I think that in sharp contrast to many patients with autism, particularly the ones that Dr. Lopez and I work with, autism had taken on kind of this character of almost like a fantasy, a gift, it's special to be this way. And, you bring something special and unique to the world that other people don't have. And it's become kind of cool and interesting to be neurodivergent. And it seems that a lot of people, rather than perhaps looking more deeply at crux of the issues that they're experiencing have happily taken on this moniker of autism as something that explains the challenges that they feel that they have, and that they can also pawn off as a very positive thing. But unfortunately, it just really bears no semblance to what autism was when it was initially described by Kanner, when it was studied in the 70s by Rudder, and all the research that we have on autism is not what currently people are terming autism. And that does do a disservice to those who have, I guess, more classic or more true forms of autism.
Please note that I cut down on that cacophonous ruckus for the sake of time, so you'd like a more in-depth breakdown on Dr. Wachtel's Big Mad directed at people with clinically diagnosed special needs, as some people call it, who have the nerve to actually describe themselves as, perhaps, special. You can watch part 7 of my video series, but that's just to catch us up to speed on our next speaker, Dr. Carmen Lopez-Arvizu, a colleague of Dr. Wachtel and supporter of NCSA, also from the Kennedy Kreiger Institute, though unlike Dr. Wachtel, Dr. Lopez-Arvizu is not an NCSA board member, just an ally. Now, let's get started for realsies.
And that does do a disservice to those who have, I guess, more classic or more true forms of autism.
I have to agree. So, that's exactly the issue, the classic definition of autism. I don't see a problem with some people identifying their differences or labeling themselves neurodivergent. It's fine. We all have our little quirks and our little differences, and that's fine.
I know I've played this clip dozens of times already in my series previously, but now that we've actually chronologically reached this point in their podcast, really, what the hell?
I don't see a problem with some people identifying their differences or labeling themselves neurodivergent. It's fine. We all have our little quirks and our little differences, and that's fine.
Identifying their little quirks and differences, labeling themselves autistic? Why the hell are these doctors responding to this article by complaining about self-diagnosis of autism? I mean, this article, which Jill Escher called extreme and weird.
So I think we're going to talk about just an example of how extreme and weird.
And that she only read the first 9% of for some reason was specifically about clinically diagnosed autism spectrum disorder patients.
Here we are told when Tahlil Javed received a formal diagnosis for autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder at 27 years old, she felt shock, confusion, and relief.
It's genuinely as though Dr. Wachtel and Dr. Arvizu are participating in a completely different discussion, where Jill Escher read them an article where the author was espousing the benefits of self-diagnosis of autism. Now, whatever I, or the NCSA, or Neurocat 2007 on Tumblr think about self-diagnosis, that subject is, as a literal matter of fact, not brought up in these articles from the NCSA. I mean, the articles that the NCSA are talking about. So really the disconnect between the Spectrum News content and the NCSA's response is so radical in their disparity that I genuinely questioned whether or not the footage of Jill reading the article and the responses from Dr. Wachtel and Dr. Lopez-Arvizu were maybe spliced together from different recording sessions due to some kind of error. Maybe even a deliberate attempt to make the doctors look foolish for some reason. Throughout my whole process of approaching this podcast analysis, I think I've been pretty concerned with presenting all the footage that I presented in an honest manner. I put big, impossible to miss timestamps over every second of footage so that my viewers could cross-verify moments from the original videos. That's the same reason I put moving watermarks over the footage that I'm quoting, to make it visually obvious as much as possible whenever I cut or splice things for time or topical focus. I don't want to deceptively edit things together to make people appear to say things that they aren't. So I really do wonder, or at least I did, what if the NCSA's footage was being presented by them, accidentally or intentionally in a misleading manner, that maybe misrepresented the context of the original discussion, leaving these two doctors to look silly?
I don't see a problem with some people identifying their differences or labeling themselves neurodivergent. It's fine. We all have our little quirks and our little differences, and that's fine. However, the use of the word autism, it's taken to the extremes because we need it for policymaking, for accessing services, for accessing education.
I sincerely don't want to misrepresent the words of these people as they were spoken and intended at the time of that recording session, or else I wouldn't have watched this podcast hundreds of times, many of those in slow motion, to be sure I understood as much of it as possible without misconceptions or misunderstandings, but...
However, the use of the word autism, it's taken to the extremes because we need it for policymaking, for accessing services, for accessing education.
Is this doctor seriously oblivious to the fact that diagnosed autistic people who are not severe cases by any measure or description, whose profiles describe them as the least adversely affected by autistic characteristics, and whose support needs are, in medical terminology, objectively superficial compared to the types of autistic people that the NCSA specifically wants to help, can still require extensive supports in order to function in an educational environment that can only be provided through special education programs, and that require some sort of professional diagnosis or examination in order for people to qualify for those programs to start with.
However, the use of the word autism, it's taken to the extremes because we need it for policymaking, for accessing services, for accessing education.
This can include access to services like occupational therapy, speech therapy, social skills counseling, physical therapy, constant access to special tools and equipment, not only at school, but at home and in public. Even service animals are a possible solution to people in this low support needs segment of autism, depending on their personal requirements. And to be clear, by low support needs, I mean people that the NCSA and perhaps the general public might think of in a casual parlance as being high-functioning autistic people. Dr. Lopez-Arvizu's somehow her direct response to that, to an account of the difficulties faced by relatively lower support needs autistic people, which once again means higher functioning autistic people, someone who was clinically diagnosed by a licensed professional to be autistic in the current context of autism spectrum disorder as defined by the DSM-5, is to say that this person's wrongfully appropriating the word autism to characterize their own little trivial quirks and differences that all people have? That they're wrongfully using the word autism, which can only be used by people who need access to special education and disability support services? This is honestly like the neurodevelopmental disability parallel to me being told by someone else that I shouldn't be using a cane because someone else needs a wheelchair by a non-disabled person who needed neither of those aids and understands nothing about their use. For years, I felt gross for even mentioning when someone else, who was dead wrong for doing so, judgmentally compared my milder mobility needs to those of others, especially when, in spite of being used as actual global iconography for disability, it's still the case that the use of wheelchairs is still widely misunderstood by the public to the lasting detriment of people who rely on them. But the deeper I get into this messy, discordant nonsense from the NCSA, the more confident I feel in using it as an example of how not to defend the struggles of disabled people by being adversarial to those who have less extensive support needs than others.
I don't see a problem with some people identifying their differences or labeling themselves neurodivergent. It's fine. We all have our little quirks and our little differences, and that's fine. However, the use of the word autism, it's taken to the extremes because we need it for policymaking, for accessing services, for accessing education, and changing, presenting this as some neurodivergence. That is such a simplistic way of represent what we see.
Neurodiversity frames human brain variations that are not of external injurious origin as natural differences that are part of a person's makeup. But that, in and of itself, does not debunk the support needs of or discredit the challenges of people with neurodevelopmental disabilities or conditions or variations or whatever else someone may want to call them. I know the word natural literally triggers people like Jill for reasons that I don't even necessarily fault them for, but it's still mistaken for them to react as though the word natural is an inherent implication of positivity in regards to their children's often heart-wrenching struggles, suffering, and limitations. That's especially true as someone who's presenting themselves as an expert on this matter in a way that maybe a casual, uninformed parent of a high support needs autistic person who is not supposed to be an expert on these things, is not in charge of a National Autism Council, as it's so called, that accepts charitable donations from the public to educate people on disability issues. That education, that knowledge, should include a baseline understanding on paradigms or ways of thinking about disability, even if that specific organization doesn't necessarily endorse or embrace those paradigms themselves. They have a baseline responsibility to understand what it is they're talking about if they want to not endorse or even criticize those points of view. Because I've listened to and read neurodiversity activists who I consider far more extreme in my views than myself, who I often don't even agree with, who specifically reject the description of human brain variation as natural being a positive distortion on the struggles of autistic people. To them, it's really more a rejection of the idea that human brains had a fully homogenized profile throughout the population, and that neurodevelopmental variation, including disability, was somehow non-existent up until the 20th century, when these divergent brain profiles were first studied and documented in a modern scientific manner.
Presenting this as some neurodivergence, that is such a simplistic way of represent what we see. There's so many of the people we serve that will never be able to even understand what a word doctor is. So that is what the conversation should be about.
Oh, okay. So Dr. Lopez-Arvizu is specifically legitimizing the idea that Jill Escher's two high support needs children are literally the objective standard for which autistic people are valid subjects of disability discussion. This literally reduces living, breathing human beings to specimen samples. Maybe I'm a radical neurodiversity activist, but I just don't consider that helpful or healthy or respectful. In fact, it kind of runs contrary to the ideology of people receiving individual personalized assessments based on a standard diagnostic manual.
Doctors with autism speak out against stigma. All right, so never mind the fact that neither of my children even understand what a doctor is. But these doctors with autism, and
there's so many of the people we serve that will never be able to even understand what a word doctor is. So that is what the conversation should be about.
Yeah, okay, so this is legit like a doctor who works with patients with limited mobility, saying that people who use canes and can stand and walk shouldn't even be considered for physical therapy or pain relief drugs, or have access to ramps and elevators, or be allowed to use service animals, because her patients, the ones she personally works with, need wheelchairs and can walk or stand very little or not at all. By the way, learn about wheelchairs and other disability aids and why people actually need them, because even in the disability community, they are widely misunderstood. Alright? If anyone takes the things I say and distorts them to discriminate against wheelchair or cane users, your soul will forfeit admittance to paradise and will suffer exile to the foul valley of stinking offal.
Doctors with autism speak out against stigma. All right, so never mind the fact that neither of my children even understand what a doctor is. But these doctors with autism, and
there's so many of the people we serve that will never be able to even understand what a word doctor is. So that is what the conversation should be about.
It was bad enough back in Buck Angel's podcast watching Amber present her own child as the literal prototypical specimen of an autistic person. But at least she was just one emotionally charged mother who at best had a limited perspective on things. I'm not going to discuss her in detail any further, but to see someone I know to be a doctor go out and validate an autism attack mom's position on something so concretely unscientific, once again, it stands in ideological opposition to the concept of patients being personally evaluated according to the standards of diagnostic manuals created by a consensus of professionals based on the latest science. Jill Escher's kids, who due to their traits of personal manifestations of autism might struggle throughout their lives to achieve a maximum potential of simply being safe and happy in an enclosed world of perpetual care, are having their struggles, their real and valid struggles, which are under-discussed and not nearly visible enough in the mainstream popular consciousness. They're having their profiles used to invalidate the separate difficulties of unrelated people they will never meet. They're being used by that purpose by what's supposed to be an autism advocacy group, and one at that that's being used by their own mother. I have no reason to doubt the quality of Jill's care for her own children in private, but as far as this public podcast is concerned, to call it outstandingly poorly considered is more praise than it deserves.
There's so many of the people we serve that will never be able to even understand what a word doctor is. So that is what the conversation should be about.
All right, Dr. Arvizu, we hear you. The conversation of autism should not be about people who could understand what a doctor is, let alone attend medical school or become physicians. It should explicitly exclude those people. Discussion of autism should only be about people like Jill Escher's children who can't even understand what a doctor is. I sure as hell don't agree with that, but you are as loud and clear on that point, Dr. Arvizu, as you possibly can get. So with that being established, go on, carry on with your arguments.
There's so many of the people we serve that will never be able to even understand what a word doctor is. So that is what the conversation should be about. If we're going to define this, or if it's defined as a spectrum, then allow the needle of the spectrum to move and allow the both extremes and the ones that are in the middle to be able to have a voice as well. Do not dominate the conversation.
What?
If we're going to define this, or if it's defined as a spectrum, then allow the middle of the spectrum to move and allow both extremes and the ones that are in the middle to be able to have a voice as well. Do not dominate the conversation.
Dr. Arvizu just said that conversation on autism should only be about autistic people who are disabled to the point of being unable to even understand the concept of a doctor. But in the same sentence, with barely a breath in between, also said that it was higher functioning autistic people who were disallowing the needle of the autism spectrum to move. Said that it was higher functioning autistic people who were dominating the autism conversation. I mean, I feel guilty almost. I feel like I'm splicing together clips of things Dr. Arvizu said in different conversations and different contexts, juxtapositioning those clips in maybe a dishonest way to make her look like a hypocrite. But I'm dead serious. These directly conflicting statements, they're not just from the same podcast. They're not just from the same conversation. They're literally from the same sentence. Imagine saying with a straight face that an entire subcategory within the autism space should be explicitly excluded from the conversation concerning autism, but then also say that the same category of people that she just declared should be excluded from the conversation were somehow actually also dominating the conversation. It makes no sense. But it maybe might if you consider that this podcast's host, Jill Escher, the president of the National Council on Severe Autism, who only minutes ago in this same podcast episode was accusing high-functioning autistic people who were said to be falsely claiming to be autistic of dominating the U.S. Government Advisory Committee on Autism, and by doing so marginalizing other groups within that body's membership roster, when it turned out that fewer than 13% of that committee's members even mentioned or described themselves as autistic in their official biographies. Why would anyone trust these people on anything? I mean, that's just my opinion based on what they themselves have presented. I don't have insider info. They just say shit that doesn't make sense.
If we're going to define this, or if it's defined as a spectrum, then allow the middle of the spectrum to move and allow both extremes and the ones that are in the middle to be able to have a voice as well. Do not dominate the conversation, because that is what bias is. And, that's something that we don't talk about enough in this kind of articles like the Spectrum publishes. It is the bias. You are absolutely writing all these documents with the bias.
Bias! Now you want to accuse other people of bias. Only seconds ago, you were saying that autistic people whose characteristic profiles don't align with descriptions of only the most severely impaired autism patients should not be part of discussion of autism at all, and that those people describing themselves as autistic, in line with their clinically administered diagnoses, constituted the theft of that word from people who needed access to special education and disability support services. And now you want to call those people biased? You're telling them to stop dominating the conversation and being biased against you? I may take heat for saying this, and I don't use this word lightly, but in terms of casual, non-clinical use of the word, the complete detachment of the arguments and grievances of these NCSA podcast panelists, including two panelists of high positions within a children's hospital that specializes in childhood disability. The detachment of these people from what's actually described in the article they're publicly complaining about is so extreme that I consider it delusional. I mean, the total lack of irony, the total lack of self-awareness, as they make accusations against innocent disabled people of bias and dominating the autism conversation, while they say biased things and dominate the autism conversation to the point of them explicitly explaining that only disabled people who closely resemble the ones they raise as their children or care for as their patients should be considered legitimate in participation in the autism conversation. It's worse than the pot calling the kettle black. At least in that analogy, there's an actual kettle in existence that the pot is calling black. What these NCSA panelists are doing in this episode, it's not like a pot calling a kettle black. It's like an angry dog barking at its own reflection in a mirror and raging with escalating fury at the illusory other dog for displaying increasing signs of unprovoked aggression and refusing to back down. I am sincerely astonished by how severely this discussion being had by NCSA members and allies is detached not just from the content of the Spectrum News article they're complaining about and the people featured within it that they're encouraging public distrust and derision of, but detached from basic facts of actual reality and the recorded history of autism and neurodevelopmental disability as recorded by people who have no allegiance or bias toward the neurodiversity movement or the autism self-advocacy movements.
What you're saying isn't real.
And when considering that this is my 8th analysis video about this podcast episode, that there's still 21 minutes I haven't covered yet of this episode. And considering that these people's bullshit only escalates from here, I mean, we're just getting started. Holy fucking shitballs.
You know, if we're going to define this, or if it's defined as a spectrum, then allow the middle of the spectrum to move and allow both extremes and the ones that are in the middle to be able to have a voice as well. Do not dominate the conversation, because that is what bias is. And you know, that's something that we don't talk about enough in this kind of articles like the Spectrum publishes. It is the bias. You know, you are absolutely writing all these documents with the bias that autism is something that is just a difference. And that is not what we see in the population we serve.
The neurodiversity movement is mentioned in this article. The paradigm is discussed in the context of a framework in which these people have come to earnestly understand the fact of their own existence, their characteristics, their strengths, their talents, and their challenges, and a context that's not restricted only to negativity. In other words, they discuss neurodiversity as a context in which they can understand that characteristics linked to neurodevelopmental disabilities can be beneficial in certain settings, can contribute to not only challenges and deficits, but also to strengths and benefits. The fact that certain very specific aspects of what might be considered relatively higher functioning neurodevelopmental disability happen to coincide with the long-running absent-minded professor trope attest to this. I'll make a note to speak on that later on in a future barrier aggression video. But these ass clown NCSA panelists, these absolute rectal jesters, posing as credible sources on disability, they're going to use the fact that the people within this article dare to describe certain characteristics of their own atypical brain profiles in a non-negative context alongside their struggles as an excuse to go on for the rest of this podcast episode pretending that this article was about facetiously self-diagnosed disability imposters claiming that the higher support needs autistic people, like those that the NCSA panelists are concerned with helping, aren't valid, and that their diagnoses aren't legitimate.
It has to, you can't say that those people are discounted or that their diagnosis isn't real, or come up with all sorts of other nonsense statements well, actually those people are just as high functioning as I am. It's a societal issue, or you don't know how to understand them. And if you listen to me, those individuals, I really, when I hear that type of garbage, I feel like, inviting them, okay, well, you know what, we're always short of direct care staff on a neurobehavioral unit. So if you'd like to come and work with some of my patients and talk to them about running for office or what type of job that they'd like to have and how they're going to purchase an apartment, have at it.
Yeah, I totally see your point. I won't mention names, but there are those quote unquote autistic doctors. Of course, I don't see a speck of autism in these people, but whatever, who have been antagonistic towards those who speak out on behalf of the severely affected. Kind of saying that we're not treating them with dignity, we're not treating them with respect, we're disparaging them, when all we're doing is communicating their reality. It's inherently awful. Their existence is inherently awful to these people.
Not only are these discriminatory ideas not present in this article, but Dr. Javed, the autistic doctor this trio specifically names and draws attention to, specifically described herself, as she's quoted in the article, of being a person with high-functioning autism, meaning that Dr. Javed herself specifically described her support needs, her personal manifestation of autistic characteristics, as she was professionally observed to possess, as so to establish the reality that there are people also diagnosed with autism that were significantly less capable of independent functionality than she was.
Javed is a psychiatric doctor in the UK and has what is called high-functioning autism, she says, meaning that she's able to live independently.
Yet these panelists specifically implicate Dr. Javed and her colleagues of participating in this article as part of an insidious misinformation campaign to draw into, scorn, contempt, to question the reality that low-functioning autistic people even exist, to claim that high-functioning autistic people like those in this article say that the diagnoses of low-functioning autistic people like the NCSA is concerned with aren't even real or valid diagnoses. That's the exact opposite of what these people said in the article. The article that these people conveniently chose to read only the first 9% of before making shit up about all the horrible claims these people made in it that, if you were to read, never were even uttered in the article. There may be a temptation by certain chronically online people who the NCSA's imagined concept of a neurodiversity keyboard warrior, who might see the organization name National Council on Severe Autism and have a knee-jerk reaction to the effect of, what about high-functioning autism? Aren't you saying that we aren't real and that we don't matter? I've seen that behavior on the web in the past among actual people who describe themselves as connected to the autism self-advocacy movement, who consider themselves neurodiversity proponents. But funny enough, the NCSA relatively higher functioning autistic people, and they spend over a half an hour themselves going, what about severe autism? What about low functioning autism? You're saying that our children and our patients aren't real and that they don't matter.
It has to, you can't say that those people are discounted or that their diagnosis isn't real, or come up with all sorts of other nonsense statements fighting for equality, equity, and equal rights for everybody. It's I always say, you cannot fight for racial equity and spout anti-Semitism at the same time. That's incongruous, and if you act like that, you're just a hypocrite. And I think it's the same thing when you're looking for advocating for rights for people with disability. If you want to advocate for yourself as somebody with high functioning autism, at the end of the day, you're just a hypocrite and just as bad as anybody else who has discriminated against people with disability if you're writing out of the equation those who are the most severely afflicted.
No one in the article says that. No one in the article suggests that. Yet Dr. Wachtell has the nerve to participate in a public indignation meeting about the people in this article, where she holds them to task for making what she calls nonsense statements that were never uttered by anyone within the article she keeps referring back to, only for her to then accuse high-functioning autistic people of engaging in a fantasy for merely describing themselves as autistic in the first place.
It's become sadly almost like faddish for individuals who have the types of challenges that are described in that article to adopt the term of, to identify as being autistic. And I think that in sharp contrast to many patients with autism, particularly the ones that Dr. Lopez and I work with, autism had taken on kind of this character of almost like a fantasy, a gift, it's special to be this way. And, you bring something special and unique to the world has to prevail. I think that we're stuck in the United States with skewing reality for a lot of fantasy on many levels. And at some point that needs to stop.
These people are projecting really bad, in my honest opinion. And in my honest opinion, it's unproductive and useless behavior. So Dr. Arvizu talks a bit about how she tries to emphasize with the caretaking families of her patients who face risks like wandering onto the street unsupervised with no sense of warning or danger, and being struck by vehicles, or being misunderstood as some sort of violent criminal and being shot. This is one of the moments in the discussion that I don't have an objection to on its own, in isolation. I don't object to her mentioning those things because they are serious hardships that autistic people and their families endure as realistic possibilities. The problem is that she then tries to loop that back to invalidate her dissatisfaction with autistic people like the ones in the Spectrum News article allegedly declaring themselves autistic in bad faith, taking extreme positions to validate their alleged autism, even though the autistic people mentioned in the article were professionally diagnosed and never made extreme positions of any nature, let alone the ones Dr. Arvizu is talking about.
So there's no way, even though I take care of these families and these patients, there is no way I can speak for them because I do not live the way they do. So this bias and this extremism on both sides of the spectrum has to stop.
Extremism on both sides of the spectrum? The only way I could reasonably interpret that is that Dr. Lopez-Arvizu seems to be taking the concept of there being a spectrum of neurodevelopmental characteristics that make up the autism spectrum, but somehow conflating that with the spectrum of ideas and positions concerning autism and the neurodiversity paradigm? Because those are totally different things. But as we go on in this podcast, it consistently seems to me that Dr. Arvizu treats the spectrum of ideas about autism and the spectrum of autistic characteristics in the context of a spectrum disorder diagnosis to be equivalent to each other with the way she speaks. And Jill, along with Dr. Wachtell and Dr. Lopez-Arvizu, they all seem to treat someone's status as being clinically diagnosed as a relatively higher functioning autistic person, aka a lower support needs autistic person, with not only being tantamount to being arbitrarily and facetiously self-diagnosed, but also tantamount to that person being a radicalized partisan of the neurodiversity movement. Treating a clinical diagnosis of any kind as a declaration of allegiance to a cause or an ideology is so fucking stupid that I don't think I need to explain. but then using that as the basis to draw into question the struggles of a disabled person you never met, and to accuse them of impeding the ability for what Dr. Wachtel, an NCSA board member, will call true autistic people to receive services and accommodations. It's not a good look for what's supposed to be a disability advocacy organization, let alone one registered as a non-profit and one that accepts tax-free donations from the unsuspecting public who are trusting you to help people that you're spreading misinformation about.
So there's no way, even though I take care of these families and these patients, there is no way I can speak for them because I do not live the way they do. So this bias and this extremism on both sides of the spectrum has to stop to really be of service for the population that we serve.
The extremism on both sides of the spectrum has to stop to be of service to the population you serve? I mean, first off, the only position in this article that you're responding to that actually exists within the article that you're responding to is the idea that high-functioning autism exists and is valid within the clinical sphere of disability care and treatment, and that some of these people, with supports, have the potential to participate proficiently in respected fields of employment. I know that's for some reason considered an extreme position according to the NCSA in this podcast episode.
But then you go to today, and all of a sudden there's this quote unquote new understanding of autism. Somebody who is a PhD, to somebody who is a doctor, to somebody who is a lawyer, right? To somebody for whom autism is a challenge, right? But not really a developmental disorder or neurodevelopmental disorder.
And that does do a disservice to those who have, I guess, more classic or more true forms of autism.
But we have extensive proof that what might be called high-functioning autism is something that's been discussed in academic and scientific contexts for many decades, as discussed in this edited excerpt from a different podcast that I'll discuss in its original context later.
I've met a lot of adults with autism who are now in their, I'd say, 40s, 50s, even in their 60s. There aren't many of them. You're a very vanishingly small population. But I meet a lot of very, very high-functioning adults who were diagnosed, back in the day when we were told only people who were diagnosed with autism, were the most severe cases. And I'll say emphatically that's not correct. I mean, Temple Grandin was not a very severe case. You're not a very severe case. Jonathan Mitchell's not a very severe case. I could think of 4 or 5 people I've met here in the Bay Area who are not very severe cases, who were diagnosed in the 70s. So I think it's a little, it concerns me that we're sort of saying, well, high functioning autism was missed. Like, oh no, not really. I'm not sure if we actually have proof of that, but that's neither here nor there. I'm just making a side observation. Now, how did you get involved in autism advocacy? Because here you were.
Once again, I did edit that for a time and for topical focus, not to distract from the matter at hand now. I'll discuss it in its unedited form later. But this nonsense we have now in the NCSA podcast about high-functioning autism being this insurgent concept that was forced into the DSM by renegade autism revisionists, it's just really silly when in this podcast the only clinical position about autism in the article they're discussing that actually exists within the article they're discussing, it's the explanation that higher functioning autistic people exist at all, and that they're actually people with neurodevelopmental disabilities, which Jill, apparently as best as I can tell, twisting a very specific phrasing of the definition of neurodevelopmental disability that applies specifically to California's distribution of autism care, I guess, funding and services, and then applying that out of that context to say that high-functioning autistic people therefore don't have neurodevelopmental disabilities.
And these aren't just any cases of autism. This isn't TikTok autism. You have to have a developmental disability to qualify for services in this system. And
fuck you!
That's just by professional, scientific, and consensus not the case. That's not some shit I made up because I want to depict people that aren't disabled as being disabled. That's just something that even going back 30 years ago in official diagnostic manuals was never true.
So this bias and this extremism on both sides of the spectrum has to stop to really be of service for the population that we serve.
Why does it have to be of service to the population that you serve? Meaning these two doctors and the National Council on Severe Autism in general. I'm not even against the idea that a group specifically catering to autistic people with the highest support needs should be a thing. But the sensible reaction from a group like that, upon seeing an article about people who are high functioning, is to accept the obvious fact that this article happens not to be about them, or about their children, or about their patients. Instead, this autism attack mom and two autism attack doctors from the NCSA are accusing the mere visibility and discussion of high-functioning autistic people as marginalizing and erasing the struggles of their patients and family members. And they're fighting back by putting out this podcast complaining that lower support needs, aka high-functioning autistic people, simply by describing themselves using the language of their clinically administered diagnoses, their professionally recognized diagnoses, are wrongfully appropriating resources and terminology that should be exclusive to high support needs children and patients. And the funny thing is, these sorts of critics of autistic self-advocates argue that autism self-advocacy ignores, excludes, or intentionally attempts to erase the existence of people with higher support needs, aka the lower functioning. The natural assumption being made is that people with higher support needs don't, can't, and shouldn't self-advocate. And the idea of autism self-advocacy is this revisionist concept that appeared out of nowhere in 2013, and that people with the autistic disorder diagnosis prior to 2013 would have never been able to engage with the concept of autistic self-advocacy, when we know for a fact from the actual written and recorded history of autism self-advocacy, from sources that have no allegiance to the autism self-advocacy movement or to the neurodiversity paradigm, that's not fucking true. Gee fucking whiz. Non-autistic people dictating who can and can't participate in the self-advocacy movement seems far more extreme to me than simply describing the ways that non-autistic world harasses and belittles relatively lower support needs autistic people. But I'm just a cartoon dog on the internet. What the hell do I know? And boy oh boy do I need a break. So in part 8 of Barrier Aggression, we only covered 3 more minutes of the NCSA's podcast episode of Primary Focus, and there's still another 20 minutes to go, of which I could expect to take at least 2 more videos for me to analyze and criticize in detail before wrapping up my project. So I'll see you all in part 9 of Barrier Aggression, and thank you for watching. Oh.